Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Let's slow everything down for a moment. Let's step back from the thunderclap of the Horus heresy, back from the virus bombs and the betrayals and the black sands of Istvan, and just stand for a second at the edge of something, at that place where the world was still whole, still holding its shape, before everything cracked and fell apart. Because the Horus heresy is so enormous, so cosmically catastrophic, that it's easy to forget the men inside it, the Primarchs, the sons, and specifically, the last moments before those sons stopped being loyal. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Great Crusade in its fullest flourishing. Imagine the scale of it. 200 years of expansion, galaxy-wide, thousands of worlds brought back into the light of human civilization, one campaign at a time, one compliance at a time. Yes, the Primarchs at the head of the greatest military force humanity had ever assembled, each one a demigod in their own right, each one commanding a legion of warriors who had been engineered for nothing except war and excellence. And at the center of all of it, the Emperor, tall and golden and ancient beyond measure, whose ambition was nothing less than the permanent survival of the human species, and whose methods were exactly as brutal as you'd expect from someone who had spent 20,000 years watching civilizations rise and collapse under the weight of their own failures. This was the stage. And on that stage, 21 demigods moved. Brothers, in the genetic sense, and in the deeper sense of having been made by the same pair of hands for the same purpose. They knew each other. They had fought beside each other. They argued with each other, saved each other's lives, frustrated each other to the point of violence. They had relationships of genuine complexity, old grudges and genuine affection, competition and respect. The kind of bonds that only form when extraordinary people spend decades in close proximity under extreme conditions. And then, across the span of roughly 7 years, starting with a dying warmaster on the moon of Davin and ending with a dead angel on the bridge of a flagship in orbit above a burning Terra, half of them destroyed it. They turned on each other. They turned on their father. They built the most spectacular act of self-destruction in the history of the species, and in doing so, they made the Imperium of man into the crippled, terrified, our rotting institution we recognize from the 41st millennium instead of the shining possibility it might have been. Why? That's always the question, and the answer is never simple enough to be satisfying, because the story doesn't want you to be satisfied. It wants you to keep turning it over. This isn't a video about the betrayals themselves, not exactly. Every one of those stories has been told 100 times. You know Istvan, you know the drop site, you know the siege of Terra and the bridge of the vengeful spirit and the golden wings folding closed for the last time. What we don't talk about nearly enough, what we almost never sit with, are the moments right before, the breaths before the breaking, the last heartbeats of loyalty. Because here is the thing that makes the Horus heresy so unbearably sad, and so endlessly compelling. These were not born monsters. They were not creatures of darkness who slithered into the Emperor's service wearing loyalty as a disguise. Most of them were devoted, truly, genuinely devoted, to the Imperium, to their father, to the dream of what humanity could become. And some of them were barely that at all, carrying wounds so deep that loyalty to anything must have felt like a foreign language. Something they had heard spoken, but never quite learned to say. What we're going to do tonight is walk through the stories of the Primarchs who fell to chaos during the Horus heresy, and for each one, we're going to find that last moment, that final beat of something approaching loyalty, or innocence, or connection, before the darkness swept in and everything changed. And for the ones who died loyal, like Ferrus Manus and Sanguinius, we'll stand with them in their final hours and understand what it cost them to hold on. This is going to be a long one. This is going to be quiet in places and devastating in others. If you've ever looked at a traitor Primarch and wondered what they were like before the fall, wondered whether they might have made different choices, whether there was a version of events where the galaxy didn't tear itself apart, this video is for you. Pour something warm, settle in, And let's go back to the beginning of the end. There is something almost architectural about the Horus heresy when you look at it from a distance. The way certain forces had to be in precisely the right positions. The way certain weaknesses had to already be present, already festering, before the wound could be opened. Chaos didn't just corrupt the traitor Primarchs, it found the cracks that were already there and split them wide. It took what was in each of them, pride, grief, resentment, obsession, love, even faith, and turned those things into weapons pointed at the Emperor's heart. And that's why each story is different. Lorgar fell because he loved too much and was punished for it. Angron fell because he was already broken when the Emperor found him. Magnus fell because he tried to do the right thing in the worst possible way. Mortarion fell because he was tired of being afraid. Fulgrim fell because a demonic sword was patient and he was not careful enough. Each fall has its own texture, its own particular shape of tragedy, and at the center of each one there is that moment, quiet or violent, private or watched by thousands, when the last thread of loyalty stretched and snapped. Let's find those moments. Let's give them the attention they deserve. Now I want to be clear about something before we go further, because it shapes how we're going to approach this story. The loyal Primarchs, Guilliman, Dawn, Russ, Vulcan, Corax, the Khan, are not the subject of this video. Not because their stories don't matter, but because their loyalty, by definition, did not have a last moment. It persisted. Some of them made terrible mistakes within their loyalty. The burning of Prospero was ordered by Leman Russ, who believed, wrongly, that he was acting on the Emperor's behalf, and that mistake cascades into consequences that echo for 10,000 years. But these are errors within loyalty, not failures of it. The loyal Primarchs held when the storm came, and why they held is its own story for another day. What we're here for tonight are the ones who broke, who bent, who had their last moment of genuinely being their father's sons, and then left that behind. And for the two who died loyal, Sanguinius and Ferrus Manus, we're going to honor their final hours with the weight they deserve. We'll begin where the heresy itself begins, with the most important son, with the one whose fall made all the others possible. Section 2. Horus Lupercal, the perfect son who was poisoned. There's an argument to be made, and it's not a small argument, that Horus Lupercal was the finest human being in the Imperium who was not the Emperor himself. And some days, the stories suggest, even that comparison felt generous in the wrong direction. While he was the first Primarch to be found, which meant he spent the most time at the Emperor's side before his brothers were brought into the fold. He grew up, in a sense, as the Emperor's only son, not in the gene labs, not in the cold distance of the Golden Throne, but in the actual intimacy of the Great Crusade. He learned to command beside his father. He learned to love the Imperium by watching it be built, system by system, world by world, in fire and blood and ceremony. He was 17 years at war, beside the Emperor, before Horus began finding his lost brothers, and in those years, something genuine grew between father and son, something that would make the betrayal so much worse. There is a description in the lore of what Horus was like at the height of the Great Crusade. When he had been elevated to War Master and stood at the head of the greatest military force in human history. He was charismatic in a way that felt less like a performance and more like a natural phenomenon, like the warmth of sunlight. Every Primarch who spent time with him came away with the impression that they were the one he truly understood, the one he truly valued. Not because Horus was manipulative, though he certainly could be, but because he genuinely was paying attention. He was curious about his brothers in a way the Emperor never quite managed to be. Where the Emperor saw his sons as instruments of his grand design, Horus looked at them and saw people. Think about what that means in the specific context of the Great Crusade's social dynamics. The Emperor was not unknowable exactly, but he was distant in the way that only a being of incomprehensible age and power could be distant. He communicated purpose and directive. He expressed expectations. He was capable of warmth. There are accounts in the lore of him being gentle, of him laughing, of genuine connection in specific moments. But the consistent experience of being around him was one of awe tipped toward intimidation. His sons could not quite relax around him in the way that relaxation requires equals. With Horus, they could. Horus would sit in the mess hall of a strike cruiser and eat with his legion's ordinary warriors. He would spend hours debriefing a junior captain after an engagement, genuinely curious about what the officer had seen and learned. As he remembered the names of legionaries who had distinguished themselves 10 years earlier and asked after them in later reunions. He had his quarrels and his enormous pride and his moments of cold calculation, but underneath all of it was a genuine investment in the people around him, a curiosity about humanity that the Emperor seemed to have lost somewhere in his long centuries. He had the personal relationship with his brothers that the Emperor never managed to build. Some of them had complicated feelings about him. The Lion was never entirely comfortable with Horus's ascendancy as War Master, and several of the other Primarchs chafed at his authority in various ways. But even the ones who weren't close to him respected him. That's not nothing. That's the product of a person who was genuinely trying, all of which makes what happened on Davin so much more devastating. The wound came from a weapon called the Kinnebrach Anathame, a chaos artifact that had been carefully placed in the hands of a corrupted planetary governor named Yugen Temba, himself a tool of the Nurglite death cults that had been patiently working in the shadows for this exact moment. The plan was not improvised. Lorgar's chaplain Erebus had been working toward this for decades, planting the weapon, corrupting the governor, preparing the ritual site. Everything was in position. All that was needed was for the War Master to be brought low. When the Anathame opened a wound that the Imperium's greatest physicians could not close, Horus lay dying on the feral moon of Davin. His sons were desperate. His equerry Malakhurst was desperate. Yet and someone among them. And this detail matters. This tells you something about where the rot had already spread. Someone suggested taking him to the Serpent Lodge, to a chaos ritual site in the swamps of Davin, where the priests promised they could save the War Master's life. Everything that followed grew from that choice. Not Horus's choice. He was unconscious. He could not consent. His sons made the choice for him, out of love and desperation, and brought him to the place where the chaos gods were waiting. It is worth pausing here to think about what this means. The warrior lodges, secret fraternities that had been seeded through multiple legions by the Word-Bearer's agents over decades, had already taken root in the Lunar Wolves. Already, before the heresy formally began, the ideological corruption was present. And not every warrior in the lodge had fallen. Most of them hadn't. But the presence of the lodges meant that when the crisis came, the people making decisions about Horus's care included individuals whose thinking had been quietly bent in directions that made Davin seem like a reasonable option. What happened inside the ritual is described in fragments across the lore. Horus was shown visions. Visions of the future. Visions of the Emperor ascending to godhood and abandoning his sons. Visions of the Primarchs forgotten and discarded once the Imperium was secured. Visions of an Imperium ruled by priests who would worship the Emperor as a deity, while the very warriors who built it rotted in irrelevance. Some of those visions were true. Some were grotesque distortions. Some were outright fabrications designed to inflame his grief and his wounded pride. Here is the specific cruelty of it. The truest parts of what Horus was shown were the most damaging. The Emperor did intend to withdraw from direct command of the crusade. The Emperor was building toward a post-military order in which the Primarch's role would necessarily change. The Emperor's relationship to divinity was not as simple as the imperial truth suggested, as the construction of the Golden Throne and his long involvement with the warp demonstrated. These kernels of real truth were wrapped in lies and presented as a coherent picture, the way that the most effective deceptions always work. Not by inventing everything from whole cloth, but by taking what is real and framing it in a way that leads you to the wrong conclusion. He was already weakened, already closer to the warp than any living person should be, and in that vulnerable space, the Chaos Gods whispered, and their whispers felt like clarity. Now here is the moment we need to hold, the moment of last loyalty. There is evidence in the lore, scattered across novels and remembrancer accounts, that even after he emerged from the coma on Davin, the corruption was not yet complete. That there was a period, days, perhaps weeks, when Horus was still in some sense himself, when the change was happening beneath the surface, but the man was still present, when the warmth that had made him the Imperium's most beloved general was still there, still real, alongside the cold new thing that was taking root in the space the wound had opened. Was there as the matter of Fulgrim's testimony, specifically what the demon in the blade of the layer later reveals about the state of things. The demon states that had it not intervened in Fulgrim's own corruption at the critical moment, the Phoenician would have gone directly to Terra and told the Emperor about his brother's betrayal. That Fulgrim, left to his own uninfluenced judgment, was going to blow the whole conspiracy open. This tells us something important. The conspiracy was fragile. It depended on the simultaneous, constant maintenance of corruption across multiple Primarchs. Remove any one of those dominoes and the chain might not fall. Which means Horus, in those early post-Davin days, must have had moments of doubt, must have sat with the shape of what he was planning and felt some part of him resist it. Or must have looked at his brothers, at Sanguinius most of all, who was probably his closest friend among the other Primarchs, and felt the weight of what he was going to do to them. He had been genuinely close to Sanguinius. The great angel had confided things to him, had trusted him in ways that were going to be weaponized against that very trust. There must have been a moment, quiet, in the dark somewhere, in the silence between one decision and the next, when Horus felt the full cost of what he had already agreed to. And the thing about Horus Lupercal is that he was smart enough and honest enough with himself to know that he was past the point of reversing course. Not because reversal was physically impossible, but because the narrative had been established. To go back now would mean explaining. But it would mean admitting what had happened, admitting that he had agreed to treason and then changed his mind, admitting weakness and manipulation and vulnerability. And Horus Lupercal had an ego as large as the Great Crusade itself. He could not bear to be seen as the one who had been fooled. His final moment of loyalty was not the moment he decided to rebel. It was the moment he decided he would rather go through with it than admit he had been manipulated. That pride, that inability to be the one who lost, was the last anchor chaos needed to cut. Everything after that was the execution of a decision that had already been made in a darkened cabin somewhere in the Sol system by a man who had been the Imperium's greatest champion and who chose, in one terrible moment of wounded pride, to become its worst nightmare instead. Section 3. Sanguinius, the angel who walked toward his own death. If Horus was the son the Emperor trusted most, Sanguinius was the son the other Primarchs loved most. There is something in every account of the Great Crusade, in every remembrance of the decades before the heresy, where Sanguinius occupies a particular space. He is described as being almost impossibly noble in the way that people use that word when they mean something that goes deeper than manners or lineage. Something about how a person holds themselves in the world, what they care about, what they refuse to compromise. He was tall, even by Primarch standards, wrapped in vast white wings that should have made him a figure of alien strangeness, but somehow made him feel more human, more approachable. Like the wings were simply a natural extension of what was already inside him. He came from the irradiated wasteland of Bel Secundus, where survival was measured in days, and the local tribes worshipped him as a divine figure, because what else do you do when something like Sanguinius walks out of the ruins? He led them in war against the mutants that prowled the dead wastes, and he learned there, in the brutal arithmetic of survival, what it meant to protect something. He took that lesson and expanded it to a galactic scale. Where some Primarchs protected their warriors because warriors were instruments of war, Sanguinius protected his blood angels because they were his sons. Not in some abstract genetic sense, but in the genuine familial weight of the word. There is a quality in the accounts of him that is almost impossible to articulate without sounding sentimental, but it runs through everything. Sanguinius was present with people in a way that very few figures in this mythology are. He noticed them. He remembered them. His blood angels adored him, not with the reverence of warriors for a distant commander, but with something closer to the devotion of children for a genuinely loving parent. And he had a gift that, depending on how you look at it, was either the most beautiful thing about him or the cruelest. He could see the future. Not perfectly, not clearly. The images came in flashes, in impressions, in the terrible weight of things that hadn't happened yet pressing against his consciousness. He had tried over the years to understand the visions, to decode them. But he was aware that prescience was not prophecy, that futures were not fixed, that what he saw was possibility rather than certainty. He tried to hold them lightly, the way a wise person holds strong opinions, ready to be wrong, open to being surprised. But some things came back too often, too clearly, with too much emotional weight to be dismissed as possibilities. And one of those things was his own death. Again and again, in different lights and different contexts, he saw himself dying. He saw Horus. He saw the bridge of a starship. He saw the end of something that had once been love. Most people, confronted with that kind of foreknowledge, would do everything in their power to avoid the circumstances that led to it. They would change course, step back from the edge. Sanguinius could not do that, not completely. Because the foreknowledge didn't come with a map of how to escape it. It came with a certainty that his death was woven into something larger, that it mattered in ways he could not fully understand. He confided in Horus about the visions early on, back when Horus was still his friend and still trustworthy. This matters enormously, and the lore uses it as one of Horus's most chilling acts. When the War Master turned traitor and began planning his rebellion, one of the things he leveraged was his knowledge of Sanguinius's foresight. He dispatched the Blood Angels to Cygnus Prime, a system seething with demonic corruption, specifically because he thought the psychic bombardment of the place might break Sanguinius or corrupt him beyond repair. He used the intimate knowledge of his brother's weakness, knowledge given in trust, as a weapon. Or think about that. The information that Sanguinius had shared in the private, vulnerable space of friendship, about the weight of seeing his own death, about the fear of what was coming, about the complicated burden of prescience. Horus took that and used it to engineer a situation that might kill or corrupt the brother who had trusted him with it. That is the kind of act that reveals more about Horus's fall than almost anything else in the lore, because you don't do that to someone you still love. The Horus who weaponized Sanguinius's confessions was not the Horus who had received them. At Cygnus Prime, Sanguinius faced horrors that would have unmade a lesser being. The entire system had been given over to the powers of chaos before the Blood Angels arrived. What waited there was not an honest battle, but a trap designed to corrupt the Ninth Legion and its Primarch, to break them with waves of demonic horror until they either fell to darkness or were destroyed by it. The greater demon Kabanda, a colossal bloodthirster of Horn, descended upon the Blood Angels, and when it fell in the fighting, it released a psychic shockwave that drove hundreds of Blood Angels into the first onset of what would later be known as the Black Rage, that terrible genetic curse that still haunts Sanguinius's sons 10,000 years later. The Black Rage is worth understanding in this context. It is a form of psychic resonance, where Blood Angels experience echoes of Sanguinius's own psychological state during his final hours, his rage and grief and determination. The first onset of it, at Cygnus Prime, where it was triggered by a deliberate demon attack. But the seed for it, the flaw in the gene seed that would allow such resonance to persist across millennia, was already there, had been there since the beginning, a shadow hanging over the Ninth Legion that Sanguinius himself had known about and grieved over deeply. And Sanguinius was tormented not just by the physical horrors around him, but by a spiritual choice placed before him by a keeper of secrets named Kairos. Sacrifice yourself to the rage fire the demon offered, and the red thirst will be lifted from your sons forever. Your genetic curse, your shame, the flaw that you had never entirely been able to forgive yourself for passing on, gone. All you have to do is step into the flame. He was going to do it. He stood at the threshold, prepared to give himself, and would have done so except that an apothecary named Meros stepped into the fire in his place, transformed instantly into an entity of pure psychic energy called the Red Angel. Sanguinius survived. The curse remained, and something in him, some piece of peace, never entirely returned. When he emerged from Cygnus and learned the full truth of what Horus had become, the grief in him must have been oceanic. He had trusted Horus with the most private thing he possessed, his foreknowledge of his own death, and Horus had used it as a targeting solution. The brother he had fought alongside, the man he had confided in, had sent him to be broken. And rather than being broken, the great angel came out of Cygnus changed, harder somehow, more resolved. The grief sharpened into something that looked from the outside like readiness. He set course for Terra, because that was where the defense was needed. That was where his father was. That was where he had to be. The Solar War brought Sanguinius back into alliance with Rogel Dawn, who was commanding the defense of the Sol system, and the accounts of this period are extraordinary in what they reveal about Sanguinius's state of mind. He is described as calm, almost preternaturally calm. Not the calm of someone who has suppressed their fear, but the calm of someone who has found a relationship with what is coming that makes the fear secondary. He told Dawn, during one of their councils, that the war would be decided at Terra, and that he was destined to face Horus. He wasn't speaking dramatically. He was stating logistics. During the siege of Terra itself, Sanguinius was extraordinary in a way that transcended military value. He was the beating heart of the defense. He was the thing the defenders looked at when everything else was horror and darkness, the figure that made people believe they might hold just a little longer. He broke Kabanda a second time, meeting the same bloodthirster who had nearly destroyed him on Cygnus Prime, and this time doing what he had not been able to do on that first encounter, defeating it absolutely, snapping the greater demon across his knee and slamming the Eternity Gate closed. Think about the physical reality of that. The Eternity Gate is a massive structure, one of the primary access points to the Imperial Palace's innermost sanctum. The Blood Angel's Primarch, exhausted from days of continuous fighting, has picked up an entity the size of a building and broke it, then threw the pieces into the demonic horde to buy time. Not because it was a good tactical decision, because the alternative was the Eternity Gate falling. He was doing this while carrying the certain knowledge of what was coming. When the Emperor teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit to confront Horus, Sanguinius was with him. They became separated in the teleportation, and the great angel found himself alone on the bridge of the traitor flagship, standing before the being that had once been his closest friend. What passed between them in those moments, we know only in fragments. We know Horus tried to turn him one last time. We know he offered Sanguinius power and survival and a place at his side in whatever came after. We know Sanguinius refused, not with rage, and as far as the accounts suggest, but with something closer to sorrow. He knew what the refusal cost him. He had known for years. He was exhausted. He was wounded from the siege, from Karbanda, from days of fighting without rest. Horus was empowered by all four Chaos gods simultaneously, operating at a level of physical and psychic might that made even a healthy, rested Sanguinius a difficult match. The fight was not fair. The fight was never going to be fair. But he landed a blow. One critical strike that cracked Horus's armor, driving a fracture into the ceramite at a precise weak point that the Chaos God's blessings had not anticipated. And in the entire mythology of the Horus heresy, that single crack, made by a dying angel who refused to yield, is what allowed the Emperor to land the killing blow moments later. The specific technical sequence matters, Sanguinius's strike created a vulnerability that no amount of chaos power could immediately repair. And when the Emperor arrived and found his son's body on the floor of the bridge, the Emperor used that vulnerability. The Emperor would have struggled to pierce Horus's defenses without it. Sanguinius, in dying, gave his father the key. There is a theory in the Blood Angel's own mythology, passed down through 10,000 years of grief and memory, that Sanguinius knew this was the shape of things, that he understood his death was not a loss, but a transaction. His life for the small vulnerability that gave the Emperor an opening, that the great angel, with his gift of foresight, walked onto that bridge, not in despair but in acceptance, not with joy, certainly, but with the clarity of someone who has seen the whole story and chosen to play their part in it. His body was recovered by Rogel Dawn and returned to the Blood Angels, who laid him to rest in the golden sarcophagus on Baal, where he remains to this day. And the psychic echo of his death at Horus's hands still lives in the gene seed of every Blood Angel. That shattering, final moment echoing across millennia, the sons of Sanguinius still reliving their father's last battle every time the Black Rage claims one of them. His last loyal moment was every single moment. From the first vision he had of his own death to the last breath on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Sanguinius never wavered, never broke. He carried the knowledge of what was coming and used it not to save himself, but to make his death mean something. Well, in the 10,000 years since, no one has found the great angel's equal, and there is something right about that absence. It honors the price of what he did. Section 4. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon's unbending loyalty. There is something almost mythic in how straightforward Ferrus Manus was. In a saga full of complex motivations, hidden agendas, psychological wounds, and spiritual crises, the Iron Hand's Primarch is refreshingly, almost brutally simple. He believed in the Emperor. He believed in the Imperium. He believed in the work of the Great Crusade with a directness that bordered on physical. And when someone he loved betrayed that work, he responded not with calculation, but with fury. The hands are where you start with Ferrus Manus, those incredible silver hands, coated in the living metal called necrodermis that he had acquired during a legendary battle with a great silver-scaled serpent in his homeworld of Medusa's mountains. The metal had flowed up his arms and bonded permanently with his flesh, giving him weapons and tools of extraordinary capability. He could shape steel with his bare grip, heat metal with his touch, craft weapons of impossible quality using nothing but his hands. And it's meaningful that the most defining physical feature of this Primarch, the thing that set him apart from all the others, was his capacity to make things, to build, to create. He was a craftsman first, a warrior second, even if the warrior part was world-shattering in its effectiveness. His great friendship with Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children was built on this foundation. Two artificers who spoke each other's language, who could sit together in Ferrus's forge and work for hours without needing to fill the silence, because the silence between creation was its own kind of conversation. Ferrus forged Fulgrim a sword of extraordinary beauty. Fulgrim forged Ferrus a hammer called Forgebreaker, and the two weapons became symbols of a brotherhood that had seemed, for the longest time, as permanent as the metal they were made from. That friendship is what gives the betrayal its devastating weight. When Horus turned and began gathering his conspirators, Fulgrim was among the first to be swept up. The demon in the blade of the layer had been working on the Phoenician for months, eroding his resistance, amplifying his pride, making the idea of perfection through chaos feel like a natural evolution rather than a corruption. And then Horus, already committed to the rebellion, sent his corrupted brother on a mission to turn Ferrus Manus. The logic was sound. From Horus's perspective, Ferrus and Fulgrim were the closest of all the Primarchs to each other. If anyone could reach the Gorgon, it was the Phoenician, and Horus had his own reasons for wanting Ferrus on his side. The Iron Hands were formidable, their Primarch's tactical mind was sharp, and his absolute loyalty to the Emperor made him a dangerous opponent. What happened in that meeting aboard Ferris's flagship, the Fist of Iron, in the private forge chamber called the Anvilarium, was one of the defining moments of the early heresy. Fulgrim came with arguments, with appeals to fraternity, as with the rhetoric that the Chaos Gods had been refining through him for months. He painted a picture of an Imperium that would crush humanity under the Emperor's boot, of a future where the Primarchs were discarded and forgotten, of a galaxy where chaos was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be embraced and channeled. And Ferrus Manus attacked him. Not metaphorically, not with words. He attacked his brother with his silver hands, and a short and brutal duel erupted in the Anvilarium that left both of them marked. Ferrus destroyed the sword called Fireblade, the one he had made for Fulgrim, in the fight, either as a deliberate act of symbolic rejection or simply because it was in the way of his rage. Fulgrim escaped, having been unable to bring himself to kill his brother even in this moment of mutual violence. He took Forgebreaker with him when he fled, and Ferrus was left standing in his forge, surrounded by the evidence of what had just happened, with a clarity that must have been almost physically painful. His dearest friend had just tried to recruit him to treason. The brotherhood of a lifetime had just been offered as a bribe for betrayal, and the answer had been so instinctive, so immediate, that there had been barely a moment of deliberation. Ferrus Manus did not agonize. He did not weigh the scales. He found out his best friend was a traitor, and he tried to kill him. That is who he was. When word reached the loyal Primarchs of Horus's full betrayal, when the captain of the Death Guard, Nathaniel Garrow, brought the terrible news to Terra on the ship called the Eisenstein, the response was to assemble the largest punitive fleet possible, 7 legions in theory, converging on the Istvan system, to crush the rebellion before it could spread. And Ferrus Manus was given field command of the first wave. He wanted Fulgrim. That needs to be said clearly and understood fully. Every account of the planning for the Istvan operation notes that Ferrus was not operating with the cold logic that his reputation for pragmatism might suggest. He was furious. He had been furious since the Anvilarium, since the moment he had learned what his friend had become. And that fury drove his planning in ways that the other loyalist Primarchs, Vulcan and Corax, who led the Salamanders and Raven Guard respectively, recognized as dangerous. They urged caution. They recommended waiting for all 7 legions to arrive before committing. They pointed out that the enemy was dug in on the Urgol Plateau behind massive fortifications, with what appeared to be 4 traitor legions holding prepared positions. This called for patience, for coordination, for the kind of measured approach that had won so many campaigns. Ferrus overruled them and charged. He took his Morlock Terminators, the absolute elite of the Iron Hands, warriors who had fought beside him for decades, and drove them straight into the heart of the enemy position. There is something almost tragic in the accounts of this advance. The black sand of Istvan V absorbing the thunder of their boots, the lines of traitor warriors holding steady ahead, and Ferrus Manus at the point of the assault, silver hands bright against the darkness. Looking for one face in the enemy formation. He found it. Fulgrim and Ferrus met in single combat amid the ruins of the Urgol Depression, and what followed was one of the most catastrophic personal encounters in the entire heresy. The already corrupted Fulgrim was armed with the Blade of the Lair, the same demonic weapon that had been gnawing at his soul for months. Ferrus had his hands and the weapons he had crafted himself, and they tore into each other in a duel that shook the battlefield around them. The accounts are fragmented here, as they often are for events of this magnitude. What we know is that Ferrus reached for his fallen sword, fingers closing around the grip that he had made, the blade flaring back to life at his creator's touch. And in that moment of reaching, Fulgrim struck. The demonic blade moved with a life beyond its wielder's intent. The lore is explicit that Fulgrim tried to pull the blow, tried in some last coherent part of himself to not do this, but the demon in the sword was stronger than his hesitation. The blade took Ferrus's head from his shoulders. The first Primarch to die in the Horus heresy. The Iron Hand's anchor, the man who had built things with his hands because he believed in making, killed at the hands of the closest friend he ever had.
Okay, I want to step out the lore for just a second and be real with you because this section hits different for me personally. Out of everything we've covered so far, Fulgrim's fall is the one that genuinely bothers me the most. Not because it's the saddest, but because it's the one that feels most unfair. Like, Angron was broken before the Emperor even found him. Magnus made a bad call under pressure, but Fulgrim, he was reaching for the right answer. He was about to do the right thing, and something else stepped in and made the choice for him. That idea that you can be doing everything right and still lose to something you couldn't see coming, that one sticks with me. And I think that's why this universe keeps pulling people back. It's not just the big battles or the cool models, it's that underneath all of it. These stories are asking something genuinely uncomfortable. How much of who we become is actually our choice? But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
And Fulgrim, in the immediate aftermath, is described as overcome with horror at what he had done, a grief so absolute that he opened himself entirely to the demon who had been whispering in his ear for months, surrendering his body to escape the consciousness of what had just happened. The demon took over immediately. There is a detail in the lore that deserves to be spoken carefully. The head of Ferrus Manus was taken by the possessed Fulgrim and presented to Horus as a trophy of victory. And then the second wave of legions arrived. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Word-Bearers, the Alpha Legion, supposed loyalists, supposed reinforcements, and they opened fire on the backs of the retreating first wave. The trap closed. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard were caught between two forces, and in the slaughter that followed, more than 9 in 10 loyalists on the surface of Istvan Fuf were killed. Ferrus Manus had died holding on to everything he believed in. He had not been corrupted. He had not hesitated. He had been the most straightforwardly loyal of all the Primarchs, and it killed him before he could understand the full shape of what he was dying in. The last loyal moment of Ferrus Manus was not a quiet thing. It was silver hands and a battle cry, and the refusal to even consider anything other than absolute resistance. It was every day of his life up to the point where Fulgrim's blade fell. His skull, recovered eventually from the traitors under circumstances the lore only partially illuminates, is said to rest on an altar at the center of the Eye of Medusa on his homeworld, watched over by an Iron Father who does not sleep, eat, or blink in his ceaseless vigil. The skull of a Primarch who held nothing back and was destroyed for it, guarded by a warrior who refuses to stop watching. It is one of the most quietly devastating images in all of 40k lore. And it honors something essential about Ferrus Manus. He deserves to be watched over with that intensity. He deserves that commitment. He earned it. There is one more thing worth noting about Ferrus Manus and his place in the story. The Iron Hands, in the 10,000 years since his death, have become one of the more emotionally complicated chapters in the Space Marine Brotherhood. They distrust flesh. They replace it with augmetics wherever possible. Their culture has evolved toward a kind of radical skepticism about anything organic. Feeling, intuition, compassion, grief. As if by cutting those things away, they can prevent the kind of failure they believe ultimately doomed their Primarch. That Ferrus's rage drove him to charge when he should have waited, or that it was his fury about a personal betrayal that outweighed his military judgment on Istvan V, that the very loyalty which defined him also made him reckless. These are conclusions the Iron Hands have drawn, consciously or not, and they have been reshaping their culture around them ever since. Which is its own kind of tragedy, layered on top of the original. The most loyal Primarch, dying for his loyalty, inspiring in his sons a suspicion of the very qualities that made his loyalty possible. The Silver Hands of Ferrus Manus, becoming over time a chapter that thinks the flesh that grieves should be cut away and replaced with something that doesn't. Section 5. Fulgrim, Perfection's last breath before the fall. In all the long catalogue of the Horus Heresy's tragedies, Fulgrim's is perhaps the one that cuts deepest because it feels most preventable. Horus was manipulated, yes, but there was already resentment there to work with, already the seeds of grievance watered across years by the Emperor's remoteness. Angron was broken before the Emperor ever found him. Magnus carried a wound that Sench's fingers had been tracing for centuries. But Fulgrim was devoted. Genuinely, completely, joyfully devoted. The corruption that claimed him had to be manufactured almost entirely from outside because there was so little darkness inside him to work with. That's what makes it so terrible. Let's establish who he was before the corruption, because it matters enormously, and because the distance between who he was and what he became is one of the greatest spans in the entire heresy. What Fulgrim was found on the mining world of Klemos, a grey and cheerless planet, permanently shrouded by dust clouds, always dim, where the population survived through industrial extraction with little room for culture or beauty or anything that wasn't immediately necessary. Into this environment came an infant Primarch, and in the way of Primarchs, he grew at unnatural speed and demonstrated abilities that bordered on miraculous. But where some Primarchs' abilities ran toward combat or endurance or psychic power, Fulgrim's particular genius was for excellence, for perfection, for making everything he touched as good as it possibly could be. He reorganized the minds of Chemos until they ran with flawless efficiency. He led the workforce in building the first art spaces the planet had ever known. But he painted and composed music and trained himself as a swordsman with the same obsessive attention to quality, because to Fulgrim, none of these things were separate. The man who could turn a sword technique into something flawless was the same man who could turn a mind's logistics into something flawless, and both were expressions of the same underlying truth, that humanity was capable of more than it had settled for, and that reaching for more was the most noble thing a person could do. He looked at the grey world around him and refused to accept its greyness as permanent. He did not merely survive Chemos, he improved it, he elevated it. He refused to accept that the circumstances of your birth determine the ceiling of your achievement. And he demonstrated that refusal by rebuilding everything around him until it was worthy of the effort. When the Emperor arrived and showed Fulgrim his legion, the Emperor's children, already named before their Primarch had been found, as though fate had written the ending before the story had begun, the Primarch's response was the same as it was to everything. He absorbed the entire project of the Legion, studied its history and its traditions and its accumulated wounds, and set about making it better. He drilled his warriors to a standard that no other legion matched. He cultivated excellence not just in combat, but in conduct, in bearing, in the way his Astartes presented themselves and represented the Emperor's dream. The right to bear the Emperor's name was something he treated as sacred, not as an honor bestowed, but as a bar to be perpetually met and re-met. His friendship with Ferrus Manus was genuine and deep precisely because it was based on this shared language of craft, this mutual understanding that things worth doing were worth doing perfectly. They were different kinds of craftsmen, Ferrus blunt and physical and happiest with metal in his hands, Fulgrim broader and more artistic. But the underlying philosophy was identical. Make it right, make it beautiful, make it worthy. And this perfectionism, this hunger for the absolute apex of everything, this is what the daemon in the blade of the layer found when it began to work on him. Not a weakness, not a failing. The demon took the finest thing about Fulgrim and turned it against him. The cleansing of Laren was a military campaign that should have taken years, while Fulgrim's Emperor's children completed it in 1 month. The Leia were a serpentine alien species who had given themselves entirely to Slanesh, their civilization built on and around the worship of sensation and excess, and they were genuinely formidable opponents. The Administratum had estimated that bringing them into compliance would require a decade's commitment. The Emperor's children scoured them from their home system in 30 days, but the cost was steep. 700 Marines dead, over 4,000 wounded. It was a titanic expenditure of lives and resources in the name of meeting an arbitrary deadline. But Fulgrim had set the deadline, and Fulgrim did not tolerate missing his own standards. In the aftermath, walking through the Leia's primary temple in the silence after the killing was done, Fulgrim found a sword. As a beautiful alien single-edged blade that sang to his perfectionist's heart in ways he couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore. Every line was precise. The balance was extraordinary. The craftsmanship, by whoever or whatever had made it, was extraordinary. He took it as a trophy, a spoil of a campaign that had cost so much. He wore it at his side, and he began to change. The change was subtle at first, the kind of thing that the people closest to him noticed before he did. A new edge to his ambition, a growing impatience with imperfection in his warriors, which curled from reasonable high standards into something punitive and cruel. A willingness to embrace excess, in pleasure, in violence, in the pursuit of new experiences, that would have seemed alien to the Fulgrim of Chemos, who had understood that excellence required discipline and restraint. He began to be short with subordinates he would previously have guided with patience. He began to see the pursuit of pleasure as indistinguishable from the pursuit of excellence. The distinction eroded so gradually, so quietly, that by the time it was entirely gone, no single moment could be identified as its disappearance. What was happening was that the Keeper of Secrets bound within the blade was working on him, amplifying his pride, feeding on his obsession with perfection, and whispering that perfection and chaos were not opposites, but partners. That true excellence required the freedom that only the powers of the warp could offer. That the Emperor's restrictions were not the framework that made greatness possible, but the cage that kept it from flowering fully, that kept the Emperor's children from becoming what they were truly meant to be. The demon was extraordinarily patient. It did not push. It did not demand. It simply made the most destructive ideas feel like natural conclusions, ideas that Fulgrim was arriving at himself under his own intellectual power. It let his pride do most of the work. There is a moment, recorded in accounts of this period, and it's crucial, when Fulgrim met the Aeldari Farseer, Eldrad Ulthran, on the maiden world of Tarsus. Eldrad had sought him out specifically, at personal risk to himself and his escort, to warn him. Horus had been corrupted. The Warmaster had been touched by chaos on the moon of Davin, and what was coming for the Imperium would be catastrophic. Fulgrim needed to know. The Eldari had seen it in the warp currents, us in the shape of futures spiraling outward from this moment, and they had decided the warning was worth the cost of delivering it. The demon-influenced Fulgrim responded by dismissing the warning as Xenos treachery and ordering his forces to attack the Aeldari delegation. He had the maiden worlds that the craft world had been trying to protect destroyed by virus bombs. In his fury at having been told something true and inconvenient, he obliterated places of sacred ancient beauty. And there is a particular irony in that. The man who had built art spaces on Chemos, who had spent his life reaching for beauty, who had chosen a career path that was as much aesthetic as military, this man gave the order to destroy worlds that the Eldari held as holy, precisely because they were beautiful. The demon had twisted his relationship to beauty itself, redirecting it so that it served only his own aggrandizement and destroyed anything that represented a standard he hadn't set. The lore tells us that there was still a version of Fulgrim present who wasn't entirely lost. Even after he had been to see Horus and heard the Warmaster's vision for a new order, even after the corruption had progressed so far that he agreed to take Horus's message to Ferrus. The daemon later admits, in the account of Fulgrim's possession that follows the Dropsite massacre, that had it not intervened at the critical moment, had it not seized control of Fulgrim's body during the duel with Ferrus Manus, the Phoenician would have gone to terror. He would have told the Emperor everything, the guilt and grief of what had just happened, and of having killed his closest friend with his own hand, was pushing him back toward loyalty with a force that months of patient corruption could not entirely overcome. That is the last loyal moment of Fulgrim. Not a grand gesture, not a speech or a charge or a sacrifice, just the interior decision, forming in the aftermath of murder, to go back, to confess, to try to undo what had been done. An impulse so quiet and so human that the demon couldn't afford to let it complete itself. In the seconds after the blade fell and Ferrus Manus was dead, something in Fulgrim that was still Fulgrim looked at what his hands had done and decided, No, no further. It reached into Fulgrim's consciousness, took his guilt and his grief and his horror, and consumed it. And in the space where those feelings had lived, it installed itself. And the man who had spent his life reaching for perfection spent the next 10,000 years as a demon prince of Slaanesh, the god of excess without limit, the god of sensation without conscience, the god of the very opposite of everything that Fulgrim of Chemos had believed in. The sword he found in the Temple of Laeran still exists in the 41st Millennium. It's been given to Lucius the Eternal, drained now of the demon that once animated it, but still carrying a charge of Slaaneshi power. And the demon prince, who was once Fulgrim, still carries Fireblade, the sword Ferrus Manus made for him in the years when their friendship was the warmest thing in the Imperium, still wears it at his side, as if he can't bear to put it down, as if the thing that cost him everything is also the only thing that still connects him to who he used to be. Section 6. Lorgar Aurelian, the son who worshipped and was spurned before any of this happened, before Davin, before the Blade of the Lair, before the drop site, before any of it. There was a Primarch kneeling in ashes. Lorgar was found on Colchis, a world dominated by a theocratic religion called the Covenant, and he was raised in it by a man named Cor Phaeron, a priest whose faith was genuine, but whose ambitions were larger than his devotion. Cor Phaeron had political motivations for embracing the infant Primarch, for elevating him within the temple hierarchy, for shaping the extraordinary child's belief into a particular channel. But Lorgar himself was not a political animal, not at first, not at the beginning. He was a man of genuine faith. The distinction matters. You can spend a lifetime surrounded by people who perform religion, who follow the rituals because the rituals are what you do, who say the words because the words are expected, who believe in the social architecture of faith without believing in its content, and then encounter someone for whom it is simply, completely, unreservedly real. That was Lorgar. The universe contained a divine principle. That divine principle was worth organizing your life around. This was not a conclusion he had reached through argument or been trained to reach through indoctrination. It was the foundational reality of his experience, as certain as gravity. He was also, by nature and by the gifts that made him a Primarch, extraordinarily persuasive. His oratory was legendary, even among beings who could level mountains with their fists. He could take the most complex theological idea and render it accessible and immediate and moving to an audience of any background. The people of Colchis heard him speak and were transformed. The warriors of his legion heard him preach and were steadied. He had the gift of making other people feel, for the duration of his words, that the universe was a meaningful place, and that their place within it was understood. When the Emperor arrived and claimed Lorgar as his son, and showed him the Imperium, Lorgar saw it through those same eyes. He saw his father not as a man, but as something more. The greatest being in the history of humanity, the living embodiment of human potential, the light toward which all the species should orient itself. Yet he was probably the last of the Primarchs to learn the lesson that almost all the others learned quickly. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped. He found it inefficient at best, actively counterproductive at worst. The imperial truth, the secular, rational, determinedly atheistic doctrine at the heart of the early Imperium, had no room for gods and no tolerance for people who insisted on finding them everywhere they looked. Lorgar either did not understand this or could not accept it, and the distinction between those two things may not matter as much as it seems. For 43 years, he and his word-bearers moved through the Great Crusade building temples. Writing scriptures, every world brought into compliance was transformed into a monument to the divine emperor. Not just conquered and pacified, but spiritually elevated. In its people, given a framework for devotion, its cities reshaped around the liturgical calendar that Lorgar's beautiful mind produced. He was slow, the slowest legion in the pace of compliance, because he was doing something more ambitious than conquest. He was building a civilization, a spiritual civilization that would endure after the legions moved on, and the emperor destroyed the perfect city of Monarchia and told him to stop. Let's inhabit the specific horror of what happened there. Monarchia was not just a city. It was decades of work. It was the fullest expression of everything Lorgar believed about what human civilization could and should be. The people of Kur, the world where it stood, had been transformed by his teaching from a fractious and struggling population into something that functioned, that found meaning, that organized around shared values, that loved the emperor with the passionate gratitude of people who had been given a framework for the universe that answered their deepest questions. And the emperor sent the Ultramarines to level it. Not just that. He came in person. He stood in the ashes of everything Lorgar had built, and he made the entire Word-Bearers Legion, every warrior to the last, kneel in those ashes while he explained, through Malkador, that they had been wrong. That the purpose of the Great Crusade was not faith, but compliance. Not spiritual elevation, but military achievement. Not the transformation of humanity's inner world, but the conquest of its outer one. The emotional mathematics of this are not complicated. The emperor, whether through genuine philosophical conviction or through a miscalculation about human psychology that he has never entirely been forgiven for, chose the most publicly humiliating possible form of correction for a son whose relationship to the universe was built entirely on the foundation of devotion to something greater than himself. He took the one thing that organized Lorgar's entire understanding of existence and demonstrated before the assembled legion that it was wrong, that the object of that devotion did not want it, found it embarrassing, and was prepared to reduce its expressions to rubble. Lorgar was said to mourn the emperor's command for a month after Monarchia, speaking to no one except Corferon and Erebus, wearing hair-shirt robes, or working through something privately that would come out the other side as a decision that would shake the galaxy. And we should sit with what he was working through because it wasn't simple. It wasn't just wounded pride, though there was certainly wounded pride present. It was a genuine spiritual crisis of the most severe kind. If the object of your worship tells you he is not worthy of worship, what do you do with the faith you have built around him? Do you abandon faith? Do you find a new object? Lorgar found a new object. The pilgrimage that followed took him and a small circle of his closest companions, including Erebus, who was already neck-deep in chaos and had been gently guiding Lorgar toward this conclusion for years, to the Eye of Terror itself. There, at the edge of real space and the warp, as they encountered the Chaos Gods directly, and for Lorgar, who had spent his entire life searching for beings worthy of worship, the Chaos Gods were exactly what he had been looking for. They were real. They were present. They responded when you spoke to them. They did not, critically, tell you that they didn't want to be worshipped. He came back a changed man. But here is the thing that separates Lorgar's corruption from the others. It happened decades before the heresy formally began. By the time Horus fell to chaos on Davin, Lorgar had already been a secret servant of the ruinous powers for over 40 years. The Word-Bearers came back from their pilgrimage into the Eye and spent 4 decades wearing the mask of compliance, fighting the Great Crusade, bringing worlds into the Imperial fold, and appearing in every external measure to be a legion that had learned its lesson at Monarchia and returned to proper function. The mask was perfect. The Emperor believed it. And underneath the mask, Lorgar and his most trusted lieutenants were building something extraordinary in scope and terrifying in intention. A conspiracy so thoroughly embedded in the Imperial military that when it finally declared itself, it would find the ground already prepared. The warrior lodges that spread through other legions. The corruption seeded into world after world during compliance campaigns. The careful, patient positioning of assets that would not declare until the moment was right. The last moment of Lorgar's genuine loyalty to the Emperor happened in the ashes of Monarchia, not after the pilgrimage, not somewhere in the 40 years of hidden service to chaos, but right there, in that month of silence and hair-shirt robes and private grief, when he was a man in spiritual agony who had not yet made the turn. In that window, however brief it was, there was a version of Lorgar who was still genuinely trying to remain his father's son while processing one of the most destabilizing experiences of his life. The window closed, and what Lorgar became instead was the architect of everything. It was his chaplain Erebus who placed the Kinnebrach anathema in the hands of the corrupted governor of Davin. The corruption of Horus, which made all the other betrayals possible, traces directly back to Lorgar's servants. The first heretic was not Horus. It was the son who had loved too much, been humiliated for it, and turned the full force of his devotion towards something that welcomed it. There is a quote attributed to Lorgar at the opening of his great heretical text, the Book of Lorgar. All he had ever wanted was the truth. Read charitably, as someone who understands the full arc of his life. This is genuinely heartbreaking. He had always been a person oriented toward meaning, toward something larger than the immediate and the practical. And the universe, specifically the being at the center of his universe, the Emperor, told him that his orientation was wrong. That meaning was a category error, that the universe was not a place of divine significance, but of rational mechanics, and the sooner he accepted that, the better. In another life, in another set of choices by both son and father, yet the man who built the perfect city might have built something that lasted. Instead, his devotion became the engine of the worst catastrophe in human history, and it was the emperor's public cruelty at Monarchia that lit the fuse. Whether the emperor knew this, whether he counted the cost and decided it was worth paying, is one of the most contested questions in the entire mythology. The lore does not answer it cleanly. It just leaves you sitting with the wreckage and wondering. Section 7. Angron, the Primarch, who was already dead. Angron told us. He told us exactly where to look and exactly what to understand, and we almost never say it plainly enough. Angron's final moment of loyalty was not during the Horus heresy. It was on a mountain on Nuceria, 100 years before the heresy even began. Off the morning the Emperor's fleet arrived in orbit and teleported him away from the death he had chosen. Let's tell this properly, because Angron's story is one of the most painful in all of 40k lore, and it gets truncated to the point of distortion. He was found on Nuceria, which was in theory an advanced civilized world, but in practice, a world where the ruling aristocracy maintained control through the institution of gladiatorial slavery. Angron had fallen to the planet as an infant, as all Primarchs fell, scattered by the Chaos Gods during the scattering, and a slaver had found him in the wreckage. He was turned into a gladiator. He was given the Butcher's Nails. The Butcher's Nails deserve to be described at some length, because they are the key to understanding everything about Angron. But they were a form of archaeotech neural implant, crude devices that the slave masters of Nuceria used on their fighting stock to heighten aggression and pain tolerance. They worked by stimulating the violent centers of the brain directly, while simultaneously interfering with the regions that governed other emotional experience: contentment, peace, satisfaction, affection. A person with the nails in their skull could feel rage and could feel the pleasure of violence, but the quieter forms of human connection became increasingly inaccessible. The implants were also slowly killing Angron. They would kill anyone they were implanted in eventually. They simply worked faster on humans than on Primarchs. Angron had these devices in his skull from childhood. He had never known himself without them. He had also never known himself as truly alone. Were the other gladiators around him, the slaves who fought and bled and died beside him in the arena, he loved them, as genuinely and fiercely as anything the nails allowed him to feel. He loved his brothers and sisters in chains. He led them in training and fed them with his own blood during the periods of starvation the masters used to sharpen their fighters. He formed with them the closest bonds the nails permitted him. And when he finally found a way to lead them in open rebellion, a full gladiatorial uprising that seized the arena and began pushing towards something like freedom, those people were his family, the only family he had ever known. He was winning. He was actually, genuinely winning. The rebellion was pushing back the noble armies sent to crush it. Angron, as a Primarch with tactical gifts that had never been properly cultivated, but could not be entirely suppressed, was making it work. And then the Emperor appeared. The Emperor, confronted with one of his lost sons and needing him for the Great Crusade, made the decision to teleport Angron out of the battle, off the mountain, away from his people. What the Emperor did not do, what he chose not to do, for reasons that the law has never entirely resolved to anyone's satisfaction, was save the rebels. He could have intervened. He could have ended the battle from orbit, could have committed his forces to breaking the aristocracy of Nuceria and freeing the gladiator rebellion. He chose not to. He took Angron and left the rebels to die, there on the mountain, with no warning and no choice. Angron's own words, preserved in the law: "I am Angron, the Eater of Worlds, and I am already dead. I died over 100 years ago, in the mountains north of the city that enslaved me. I died after Deshalika." Deshalika was the name the gladiators used for their communal spirit, their solidarity. When Angron was taken from that mountain, that was the death he mourned. Everything after was just the machinery of a body that refused to stop working. The Emperor took this shattered, grieving man and gave him command of the Warhounds Legion, a legion already known for aggression and violence, a population of soldiers who had been recruited partly for their ferocity. And Angron, unable to make them understand what had been done to him, because the nails had already degraded his capacity for the kind of emotional expression that might have communicated it. He responded by demanding they take the same implants, that his sons suffer as he had suffered, that the butcher's nails go in. Some of the legionaries refused. Some ran the calculus of what this would cost them and tried to resist. But Angron was their Primarch, and the ones who accepted, and over time, almost all of them accepted, became the World Eaters. A legion named after a battle cry that had been meant to honor the gladiators who had died on Nuceria. Named after Angron's grief, built in the shape of his wound. Was there any loyalty left? Any genuine connection to the Emperor or the Imperium? Here is the closest thing to it. In the early years after his reunification with his legion, before the full weight of what the nails were doing to him had completely eroded his capacity for complex thought, yet there are accounts of Angron as a formidable military commander. Not a cheerful one, not a warm one, the nails made that impossible, but a capable one. Someone who, for brief windows in the spaces between violence, could engage in something like strategic thinking, like brotherhood, like the shared project of winning. The Night of the Wolf is a crucial event here. Leman Russ, the Space Wolves Primarch, confronted Angron about the use of the butcher's nails on the World Eaters, confronted him in the blunt and direct way that was entirely Russ, and they fought. The fighting was stopped before either died, but the point Russ was making was not missed. He was telling Angron that what he was doing to his sons was wrong, that a Primarch's job was to elevate his warriors, not break them the way Angron himself had been broken. As Angron heard this, Lorgar, years later, reflected on it. Something had gotten through, in the way that things sometimes do to a person you wouldn't expect to reach. Angron had understood, on some level, that Russ was right, and it hadn't changed anything, because by that point, the nails were too deep, the grief too heavy, the road too far gone to turn around on. But the understanding was there, which is a kind of tragedy in itself, to understand something is wrong and be unable to stop it. Horus found him at this crossroads of understanding and despair and told him exactly what he needed to hear. The Emperor was a tyrant. The Emperor had stolen Angron's people from him. The Emperor was no better than the overlords of Nuceria, just writ larger, and there was a place in Horus's rebellion for Angron's rage, an outlet that was finally commensurate with the fury the nails had been building in him for a century. The last moment of Angron's loyalty to anything wasn't even loyalty to the Imperium. It was loyalty to the people who died on that mountain. And the Emperor had ended that loyalty the moment he teleported Angron out of a battle he had chosen to fight. During the Shadow Crusade, Lorgar brought Angron back to Nuceria, ostensibly to give him closure, and what happened there tells you everything. Angron ordered the planet cleansed, killed, every living being on the surface, not as a military necessity, but as a statement of grief so total that it had become its own kind of obliteration. The world where he had been enslaved, and the world where he had found his family, and the world where his family had died, all of it reduced to nothing, so that the memory had nowhere to live except inside him, which was the only place it had ever truly lived anyway. After Nuceria, Lorgar performed a ritual of chaos that channeled Angron's rage through a cornate framework, and the Primarch ascended to demonhood. The being that had been Angron, already more wound than man, already more rage than anything else, became a demon prince of Khorne, and the last thing that might have been called human in him was consumed by fire. He did not want what he became, but he had wanted so little for so long, and had been given even less, that perhaps at the end there was no difference left between wanting and not wanting, only the killing and the fire, and somewhere deep in the core of it, the memory of people who had called themselves Deshalika, and a mountain he never made it back to. In the 41st millennium, Angron has been banished from real space and returned, has fought wars that span decades, has remained one of the most terrifying entities in a universe full of terrifying entities. He is not a complex creature anymore. The nails took complexity from him long before demonhood did, but there is a line in the lore, in one of the accounts of his return during the First War for Armageddon, where he stands on a battlefield and is described as looking at the horizon for a moment, just a moment, before the killing resumed. And the warriors watching this brief stillness could not have understood what they were seeing, but we can. We know what horizon he was looking at. We know which mountains. Section 8. Mortarion, the Lord of Death who feared one thing. Of all the things Mortarion could have feared, the one thing he feared most was irony. And irony came for him anyway, in the most complete and terrible way possible. He was raised on Barbarous, and the name suits the place. A world permanently shrouded in a poisonous fog that rose from the mountains, where the human population was forced to live at the lowest altitudes, because the higher you climbed, the more toxic the air. And in those high places, above the choking line where human life ended, lived the overlords, warlords who had mastered the fog, or at least survived it, who were something between human and something else, who used the poisoned heights as both their domain and their weapon. The humans below lived at their mercy, able to survive only as long as the overlords allowed, culled or used as they wished. Well, the psychology that Barbarous produced in Mortarion is worth examining carefully, because it shaped everything that came after. He grew up understanding the world through a very specific lens. Power was the product of endurance. The people who ruled Barbarous ruled because they could survive in conditions that killed everyone else. The fog was the test, and the warlords had passed it. The humans in the lowlands hadn't. In a brutal, honest, deeply unfair way, this was accurate. And it gave Mortarion a framework for the universe that was simultaneously his greatest strength and the core of his eventual undoing. He organized the lowland humans. He trained them to push against the fog, to build tolerance through exposure, to become harder. He fought the lesser warlords with an army of people who had no business winning and won anyway, because a Primarch's tactical gift is what it is, and because the people fighting for him had everything to gain. He pushed toward the summit where his adoptive father, Nekare, waited, the most powerful of the overlords, the one who had raised Mortarion specifically to be controllable, to be just capable enough to be useful, and just limited enough to remain dependent. And there, at the edge of victory, the Emperor arrived. The Emperor went up the mountain himself, into the air that was killing Mortarion, and he killed Nekare while Mortarion watched, unable to reach the summit because the fog was too thick, the poison too concentrated. The Emperor took Mortarion's victory from him, the thing that Mortarion had worked his entire life toward, and the closure he had been building toward since childhood. The Emperor reached it first and claimed it, and what should have been Mortarian's act of freedom became instead a demonstration of the Emperor's power and a reminder of Mortarian's limits. He swore loyalty, because what else do you do when a being that can walk where you cannot walk stands before you offering service and legion and purpose? But under the oath was a wound that never closed, and in the wound was resentment, and in the resentment was a question that Mortarian never stopped asking. What is the actual difference between a tyrant at the top of a mountain and a father figure who walks up a mountain you couldn't reach and takes your kill? The things Mortarian believed most deeply were these: that weakness was the enemy of life, but that poison and hardship were honest teachers, and above all else that he despised the use of warp power. He had grown up watching the overlords of Barbarous use something that felt like sorcery to maintain their dominance. Whatever they had done to themselves to survive in that fog was not fully understood, but it felt like cheating in the specific way that using hidden forces to circumvent honest limits always feels like cheating to someone who has built their identity around endurance. He had learned to equate psychic power with tyranny, with the kind of authority that worked through means you couldn't see or defend against, that operated outside the honest rules of strength and persistence. His hatred of psychers was categorical and loud. He argued against the Legion's librarians at every council that would hear him, and he voted at the Council of Nicaea to ban psychic practices across all the Astartes legions. He distrusted Magnus the Red on deep principle, finding the Thousand Sons' embrace of warpcraft personally offensive, in the specific way that only someone with a long personal history of being harmed by similar forces can find a thing offensive. Not abstractly wrong, but viscerally, immediately wrong in a way that lived in his body. And then Horus whispered to him. The information Horus offered was this: the Emperor had used warp power in the creation of the Primarchs, that the very beings standing in the Great Crusade had been made through exactly the kind of power Mortarian most despised. That the imperial truth, the secular rational framework that declared there were no supernatural forces at work in the universe, it was a lie being told by the galaxy's most powerful sorcerer to keep his tools from understanding what they were made of. The Pale King felt the floor go out from under his feet. The father he had grudgingly served, the authority he had accepted while nursing resentment, was not the honest force of will and endurance he had dressed himself as. He was Nakar, writ larger, a being of tremendous power who had used forces beyond normal human capacity to situate himself at the top of a hierarchy, and who maintained his position through tools that his subordinates were not permitted to understand or use. The fog of Barbarous and the warp beneath the Golden Throne were, from Mortarian's perspective, the same thing. The secret advantage of a ruler who claimed his position was earned through merit while hiding the mechanism that made it possible. Horus didn't need to do much more. The work was already done. The resentment had been aging in its container for decades. All Horus had to do was open it. There is a detail about Mortarian's relationship to the heresy that distinguishes him from the other traitors in an important way. He never stopped telling himself that he was mastering chaos rather than being mastered by it, even as he used chaos artifacts, even as he studied forbidden knowledge, even as his death guard moved deeper into the service of the ruinous powers. Mortarian maintained the fiction that he was in control, that his engagement with warp power was rational, studied, purposeful, different from what Magnus had done, different from what Lorga had done, because it was informed by skepticism rather than faith, by research rather than devotion. But this self-narrative is perhaps the most revealing thing about him, because what it tells you is that Mortarian's pride was not less than the other Primarchs. It was just differently organized. He was not proud of his power or his victories in the obvious way. He was proud of his independence, his freedom from the control of forces greater than himself, proud of being the Primarch who saw through the facade, who understood what was really happening, who would not be used. And the Chaos Gods, who are patient in exactly the way that someone who exists outside of time can afford to be patient, let him tell himself that story for as long as it was useful. The plague that hit the Death Guard fleet in the warp was not an accident. It was Nurgle's deliberate design, executed partly through Mortarion's own first captain, Typhus, who had already made his private bargain with the grandfather of plague without the Primarchs' knowledge. The fleet was stranded between real space and the Imperium, and the disease that spread through it was supernatural, fueled by warp power, targeting the specific resilience that was the Death Guard's pride, making them unable to die while filling them with corruption that should have been fatal. This is what breaks Mortarion. Not the disease itself, not the physical suffering, though the accounts of it are genuinely horrible. The Death Guard, these warriors who had endured things that would kill anything else, were bloated and rotten and screaming and unable to die, their endurance now the mechanism of their torment. What breaks him is the meaning of it. Because this is the mountain on Barbarous again. This is the moment when he can't reach the summit, when endurance alone is not enough, when something operates on him through forces he cannot counter with will and discipline and the accumulated hardship of a lifetime. He called out to Nurgle. The Plague Father answered, and what emerged from the warp bore no resemblance to what had entered it. Mortarion's last loyal moment, his last moment of being the independent, self-determining Primarch who would not be used, was wherever he had been standing before the plague took hold. In some corridor of a Death Guard battle barge, somewhere in the space between one moment of endurance and the next, still believing he was the one who chose, still telling himself the story, still convinced that mastery was possible. The story ended when he asked for help. And the irony that completed itself was this. The man who spent his life hating tyrants who controlled others through secret power became the eternal servant of the Plague God, the most personal of all the Chaos Gods, the one who reaches inside you and changes what you are at the cellular level, the one whose gifts you cannot refuse and cannot remove, the one who makes you his through the intimacy of disease. No overlord on Barbarous had ever managed what Nurgle accomplished in the warp outside Terra's orbit. Mortarion became more thoroughly owned than he had ever been on Barbarous, because at least on Barbarous he had known who Nakaer was. Section 9. Magnus the Red, the scholar who tried to save everyone. There is an argument that Magnus the Red did nothing wrong, and there is an argument that Magnus the Red did almost everything wrong. And the extraordinary thing about his story is that both arguments are simultaneously correct, and the fact that both are correct at the same time is precisely what makes his fall so impossible to look away from. He was the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, the scholar soldiers who had dedicated themselves to the study of the warp with the same systematic thoroughness that other legions gave to combat doctrine. He was enormous, even by Primarch standards. Magnus was physically imposing, copper-skinned, cyclopean after an early act of forbidden magic cost him one of his eyes in a moment of youthful overreach that he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget, and the rest of the Imperium trying to hold over him. And he was psychically powerful beyond description, the greatest natural psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor himself, possessed of an intellect and a curiosity that would have been extraordinary even without the supernatural amplification. He loved knowledge in the way that only someone who has always found it possible to understand things loves it, not as a status symbol or a power tool, but as a relationship. The libraries of Prospero, the Thousand Sons' homeworld, were his in the same way that Ferris's forge was Ferris's, not owned but belonged to, not possessions but extensions of self. The city of Tizca, the City of Light as it was known, was a monument to what human learning could become when it was given generations to accumulate and space to spread. A pyramid complex of knowledge that the Thousand Sons had been building since before the Great Crusade reached them. A repository of everything they had learned about the universe's hidden architecture. Magnus's relationship with his father was genuinely warm in a way that not many Primarchs could claim. The Emperor was interested in Magnus's work. He visited Prospero. He sat with his son and discussed psychic theory and the nature of the warp and the possibilities of human evolution and these conversations were, by all accounts, among the most genuinely engaged exchanges the Emperor had with any of his sons. Where Lorgar wanted to worship his father and was denied it, Magnus and the Emperor were something closer to colleagues. Two extraordinary beings who both happened to have unusual relationships to the Imperium, talking shop across the kitchen table of an intergalactic empire, which is part of why the Council of Nicaea cut so deep. The council was called to address the growing controversy around psychic practices within the legions. Magnus argued passionately for the value of the Librarius system, the structure through which Psyker legionaries were trained, supervised, and used in service of the Great Crusade. He argued that the danger was not psychic power itself, but the ignorance around it. That the solution to the risks of warp engagement was more study, better training, greater understanding, that you could not make the warp go away by pretending it didn't exist, and that an Imperium that refused to develop its understanding of the Immaterium was an Imperium walking blindly toward the very dangers it was trying to avoid. The Emperor ruled against him. The Librarius was to be disbanded. Psychic practices were to cease across all the Astartes legions. It was a clear and direct order from the Master of the Imperium, made in full council, and its implications for the 1,000 Sons in particular, whose entire cultural identity was organized around psychic scholarship, were profound. Magnus went home to Prospero and kept studying in secret. Let's be honest about what this was. Defiance. He disagreed with the ruling. He thought it was wrong, and instead of accepting the ruling and working within the limits it set, he continued doing what had been forbidden. This is the first thread of the tragedy, the first place where Magnus's certainty about his own judgment, well-founded certainty, built on decades of genuine expertise, led him to a decision that had catastrophic downstream consequences. Yet he peered through his psychic sight and found what he was looking for in the warp currents around Davin, a vision of Horus, a vision of corruption, a vision of what was being planned. He saw the shape of the heresy before it began, saw it with the clarity that only a psychic of his magnitude could achieve, and made the choice that felt obvious to him. Act immediately. Warn the Emperor directly. Don't wait for astropathic messages to filter through the bureaucracy. The threat was real and urgent, and the Emperor needed to know now. What he didn't know, what he genuinely, catastrophically did not know, was the full scope of what the Emperor was doing in the lower levels of the Imperial Palace. The Webway project was the most delicate working the Emperor had ever attempted. Yet a centuries-long effort to map and adapt the Aeldari's psychic transit network for human use, to render the dangerous tides of the warp obsolete as a means of travel and communication. The defenses the Emperor had built around it were complex beyond description. Psychic wards of extraordinary sophistication, designed to keep the warp from leaking through the breach that the project required. Magnus's breakthrough hit those defenses like something enormously powerful hitting something very fragile. The protective wards shattered. The breach the Emperor had been so carefully managing became, in an instant, a wound. Demons poured through into the lower levels of the Imperial Palace, and the Emperor's custodians had to fight them back over days of desperate close-quarters horror, while the Emperor himself worked to close what his son had accidentally opened. The Webway project, built across centuries, was permanently compromised in a single night. The Emperor's response was volcanic. He ordered Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero, specifically to bring Magnus back to Terra to account for what he had done. The order was to arrest Magnus and return him for judgment, not to destroy him. But this is where Horus made one of his most consequential moves. He intercepted the orders given to Russ, and through a combination of manipulation and selective truth-telling, convinced the Wolf King that the Emperor's true intention was destruction rather than arrest. Russ, who had always had a profound and visceral distrust of anything that smelled like sorcery, and whose relationship with Magnus was colored by genuine antipathy, carried out what he believed were his orders with the Space Wolves' legendary ferocity. Prospero burned. Magnus stood at the window of his pyramid of Photep, and watched his libraries burn. The accounts of this moment are among the most quietly devastating in all the Horus Heresy novels. He had done something wrong. He knew he had done something wrong. The magnitude of the webway damage was legible even through his own grief. But the response was disproportionate in a way that felt less like justice and more like something else, something orchestrated, something that fit a narrative he could not quite see all the way to the edges of. Yet he refused to give the order to fight back for as long as he possibly could. The Space Wolves were attacking his people, killing his scholars, burning his libraries, and Magnus held the order. Because the Space Wolves were his brothers. Because fighting back felt like crossing a line from which there was no return, and he was not ready to cross it, and would not cross it until crossing it was the only thing standing between him and total destruction. When the moment finally came, when Lemon Russ himself was close enough that non-resistance meant death, Magnus used a massive ritual to gather what remained of his legion and his most precious archives and transport them into the warp, to the demon world that Cinch had been quietly preparing for exactly this eventuality. The transportation shattered Magnus. What the psychic energy required was beyond what even he could channel without cost, and his consciousness fragmented into pieces, each one a different facet of the whole, scattered across the Imperium like shards of a mirror. His last loyal moment is him at that window, watching the fire climb the pyramids, refusing to give the order. He was being punished for trying to save the Imperium, punished for acting on genuine love for his father and the people of his world, and his response was to absorb the punishment rather than compound the wrong by fighting his brothers. That the punishment was manufactured by Horus, as that the entire situation was engineered by a conspirator who needed Magnus broken and driven into Chaos's arms. None of that reached him clearly in the smoke and the noise and the sound of 10,000 years of scholarship burning. When the pieces came back together in the Eye of Terror, in the planet of the sorcerers that Cinch had built as both gift and prison, they came back changed. The reconstructed Magnus is a being who has processed the full architecture of what happened to him and drawn from it a specific conclusion: that the Emperor sacrificed him, that the burning of Prospero was not an error but a choice, or at minimum an outcome the Emperor accepted without the care a father should have shown. And this conclusion, which is partly true and partly the distortion of a wounded mind that needed to make sense of an incomprehensible loss, completed the work that Horus had begun. What Cinch got in the deal was the greatest psychic sorcerer in the galaxy outside the Emperor himself, furious and freed from the constraints of imperial service, willing to do what he had spent his life resisting, give himself entirely to the warp. What Magnus got was power and a place to exist, and the freedom to study without restriction. And somewhere in that bargain, the scholar who had believed so passionately that understanding the warp was humanity's best defense against it became the instrument of everything he had most feared. The irony, the awful, infinite, galaxy-spanning irony, is that Magnus had been right, but the warp could be engaged rather than avoided. Psychic power was a tool that could serve humanity rather than destroy it, if it were properly understood. His central insight, the argument he had made at Nicaea and been overruled on, was vindicated by the very catastrophe that followed the overruling. An Imperium that better understood the warp might not have been so vulnerable to Horus's manipulation, might have been able to detect the corruption earlier, might have had the tools to address the webway breach without shattering Prospero. But being right doesn't protect you from consequences, and being right in the wrong way, and in the way that involves ignoring the rules set by the most powerful being alive and accidentally destroying something irreplaceable in the process of trying to help. That kind of rightness comes at a price that makes being right feel almost worse than being wrong. Section 10. The ones we haven't named. Perturabo and Kurz. We've talked about 7 Primarchs in depth. Horus, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, Fulgrim, Lorgar, Angron, Mortarion, Magnus. But for the sake of completeness, for the sake of honoring the full picture of what fell, there are 2 more worth acknowledging. Not in the same depth, the lore around them is less rich in the specific dimension we've been exploring, but with enough weight to do them justice. Perturabo was the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, and his last loyal moment is one of the most quietly devastating in the saga, precisely because of how unremarkable it appears from the outside. He was found on the world of Olympia, raised in a city-state that valued engineering and strategy, and he spent his great crusade career doing something that no other Primarch was quite as suited for, and none of the others particularly wanted to do: siege warfare. The systematic, unglamorous, mathematically precise work of breaking through fortifications and grinding down defended positions. He was extraordinarily good at it. He was also never celebrated for it. Here is the shape of Perturabo's wound, and it is smaller and more human than most of the others. He was not appreciated. His legion was sent to the hard assignments, the ones that would cost lives and take months, amid the sieges that other legions wouldn't touch. While Horus's lunar wolves and Guilliman's ultramarines accumulated glory and honor in great sweeping campaigns, the Iron Warriors dug trenches and pushed through minefields and ate casualties by the thousand, because that was what the Imperium needed from them. Perturabo was deeply intelligent, deeply sensitive despite his forbidding exterior, and deeply aware of exactly how his contributions were valued compared to the more glamorous achievements of his brothers. He never said this openly. He brooded. He nursed the resentment in private while continuing to do exactly what was asked of him, and the resentment grew across decades until it was larger than the discipline containing it. His last loyal act is sometimes cited as the purging of Olympia, or when his homeworld rebelled against imperial rule. Perturabo led the Iron Warriors in suppressing it, not with the minimal force necessary, not with the careful restraint that a Primarch with genuine investment in the place would have used, but with the full weight of a legion's wrath. Olympia was effectively destroyed, its population slaughtered or enslaved, because Perturabo had decided that his ties to it no longer constrained him. This is usually described as his moral break from the Imperium, the moment when he decided that the rules of civilized conduct no longer applied to him, and that nothing he destroyed in their name could be lost, because he had decided it wasn't worth protecting. When Horus approached him with the invitation to join the rebellion, Perturabo had already made the most important decision. He had already decided that nothing in the Imperium commanded his loyalty anymore. Horus just gave him a direction to point the conclusions he'd already reached. Konrad Curze is a harder story and a darker one. The Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, was found on Nostramo, a world of eternal darkness, where the sun barely reached, and the population had built a civilization of fear, crime, and brutal hierarchy in the absence of light and hope. Into this came Konrad, who had from birth a gift that could only be called a curse: precognition. Not the gentle flashes that Sanguinius experienced. Something more total, more intrusive, more damaging. Visions of violence, of death, of suffering, flooding his consciousness from childhood. He could see what people were going to do before they did it. But he could see what was going to happen to people before it happened. He used this to terrorize Nostramo into order. He became the Night Haunter, a figure of pure dread, hunting down criminals in the dark and leaving their remains in public as a message. It worked. Fear worked on Nostramo. The crime rate dropped. The violence abated. The population submitted to an order built entirely on terror rather than justice or law. And Kurz became convinced, the only conclusion available to someone with his psychology and his gifts, that this was the truth about how civilization functioned. That order and fear were the same thing, ultimately. That beneath every system of law was simply the threat of pain, and the honest version of governance acknowledged this and used it openly. What the emperor collected him from this philosophy and put him in charge of a legion. The Night Lords were never entirely controllable. Kurz was never entirely stable. The visions didn't stop, and what they showed him became increasingly apocalyptic. Visions of his own death, visions of the heresy, visions of what he would do and what would be done to him. He tried to tell the emperor. He stood before his father, in one of the most extraordinary confrontations in the pre-heresy lore, and showed him what was coming. The Emperor's response, measured, dismissive, confident that the future was not fixed, was not the absolution Kurzi was looking for. When Horus turned, Kurzi went with him, but the accounts suggest it was less a choice than a resignation. Kurz did not fall to chaos in the way the others did. He didn't become a demon prince, but he remained, throughout the heresy and after, recognizably himself, which in his case was a figure of absolute darkness who understood that what he was doing was wrong, and did it anyway, because he had decided that the Imperium's justice was a lie that didn't deserve his cooperation. He was killed, eventually, by an Imperial assassin. And the lore suggests he knew it was coming, had seen it, and chose not to prevent it. His last loyal moment, if it can be called that, was somewhere in his confrontation with the Emperor, in that window where he was still trying to communicate something, still trying to make his father understand what the visions showed, still hoping, on some level, that the Emperor would take seriously what Kurzi was telling him. When that hope ended, something else took its place. Not loyalty to Horus, and not faith in chaos, just the cold certainty of someone who has given up on the possibility of being understood. These two stories, Perturabo's resentment worn smooth by decades into something that barely needed a push to fall, and Kurzi's darkness that was present from the beginning and never found a framework that could contain it productively, are different from the others we've examined. They don't have the same quality of last-moment luminosity. There is no Perturabo standing at a forge making something beautiful, no Kurzi looking at the future with hopeful eyes. The tragedy is quieter, more interior, more about the long, slow erosion of something that was never as strong as it should have been. But they are still part of the full picture, and the full picture is what we owe this story. Here's the thing that we never say clearly enough about the Horus heresy, and I want to say it now, at the end of all of this, because I think it matters. The Primarchs who fell were not evil. Not any of them. Not even Lorgar, who was the first and in some ways the most deliberately chosen, who spent 40 years wearing a mask of loyalty while planting the seeds of catastrophe. Even Lorgar was not evil in any simple sense. He was a man whose need for faith had been rejected by the one being he had trusted to validate it, and who found something else to believe in. That the something else was catastrophic does not mean the hunger it fed was wrong. This is worth repeating, because the Imperium of man, in the 41st millennium, has an official narrative about the heresy that smooths out all the nuance. The traitors were traitors, and the loyalists were heroes. The fall was a corruption. This is a functional mythology. It gives people something to orient their loyalty around, and it places the blame clearly enough that the story becomes actionable. You know who to mourn and who to curse, but it is not the full story. And I think one of the reasons this lore has endured and grown and developed the depth that draws us all to it is that the people who built it refused to let that simple version be the only version. They kept writing the complexity back in. They kept giving the traitors their humanity, even as those traitors were committing acts of galaxy-spanning horror. They kept asking the question, what would it take for you to become this? What would need to go wrong, and in what order, and with what particular pressure applied to what particular wound? As we talked about Horus, who was the Emperor's most beloved son, and was broken by a combination of manipulation, genuine grievance, and a wounded moment in which he was most vulnerable. We talked about Sanguinius, who never broke at all, who carried the foreknowledge of his own death like a weight across the entire heresy, and chose to walk into that death because it was the only way to give the Emperor the opening he needed to save humanity. We talked about Ferrus Manus, who charged into the trap with his silver hands bright and his fury absolute, and his loyalty so simple and so real that he couldn't even imagine the shape of betrayal before it came for him. We talked about Fulgrim, who was the most preventable of all the falls, who was reaching for the right choice even at the last moment, and was stopped by a demon that understood human psychology better than its victim did. We talked about Lorgar, who loved so completely that when the object of his love rejected him, he turned that love inside out and aimed it at the most destructive possible target. We talked about Angron, who was the most tragic of all, because his last loyal moment was not even within the frame of the heresy. It was 100 years earlier, on a mountain he never got to die on. We talked about Mortarion, who was afraid of becoming his abuser and became something worse, and who never stopped telling himself that he had a choice, even when the choice had been made for him. And we talked about Magnus, who was trying so hard to save everyone that he never stopped to properly calculate the cost of saving them in the way he was choosing to save them, and who watched everything he loved burn rather than lift a hand against his brothers. Every one of these stories is, at its root, a story about love, about what people love and what happens to them when that love is betrayed or rejected or twisted beyond its intended shape. Lorgar loved the Emperor as a god. Fulgrim loved his closest friend and the dream of human perfection. Angron loved the people who died on the mountain. Mortarion loved the idea of a universe where strength and endurance counted for something, where the rules were honest and the outcomes were earned. Magnus loved knowledge and his father and his scholars and his libraries. Even Horus, corrupted and terrible, had at his core a love for the Imperium he was destroying. A version of it, at least, the version he had been promised in the lies of Davin. The Chaos Gods didn't create these loves. They couldn't have. You can't synthesize something that complex out of nothing. What they did was find the loves and find the wounds they'd created, and work the wounds open, and turn the love into fuel for something that burned rather than illuminated. And this is why the Horus heresy endures. Not because it's a story about battle, though the battles are extraordinary. Not because it's a story about space marines, though the space marines are compelling. It endures because it's a story about failure, and specifically about the failure of people who were genuinely trying, people of enormous ability and genuine devotion who were undone not by their weaknesses, but by the very things that made them capable. And then there are the ones who held. Sanguinius, who knew what was coming and walked toward it. Ferrus, who never hesitated for a single breath. Jagatai Khan, the White Scar's Primarch, who had every reason to sit on the fence. His legion was isolated. His relationship with the Emperor was complicated. The arguments Mortarion made to him on the ruins of Prospero about the Emperor's use of warp power were the same arguments Mortarion had found devastating, and who looked at all of that and chose the Emperor anyway. Rogel Dawn, who had to be the wall while the fire burned down everything around him, who received the broken body of Sanguinius from the wreckage of the vengeful spirit and held his dead brother's weight in his arms, and who kept building. Lemon Russ, who made terrible mistakes. The burning of Prospero was a mistake, and the law doesn't shy away from it, but whose loyalty to the Emperor never wavered, even when his judgment failed. What the people who held had, that the people who broke did not, was an anchor, something that persisted through the storm rather than being defined by it. Let's think about what that anchor actually was for each of them. For Sanguinius, it was love, but love of a particular kind. Not the transactional love that can curdle into resentment when the beloved doesn't return it in the expected measure. Not the worshipful love that collapses when the object of worship is shown to be imperfect. A love that had made peace with the cost. A love that had looked at the full price and decided to pay it. That kind of love is the rarest thing in the universe, and the great angel had it. For Ferrus, it was simplicity, which sounds like an insult, but isn't. The simplicity of a person who has examined what matters and committed to it without reservation, who has decided that the examination is complete and the conclusion is clear, and the work of commitment can begin. That kind of simplicity is not the absence of intelligence, but its application. Ferrus was smart enough to know what he valued and decided to stop debating it. For Dawn, it was stubbornness, which is simplicity's cousin. The Imperial fists are known for being immovable, and Rogal Dawn more than any other expression of that quality. And some people would hold a position as long as it seemed tenable and then adapt when it became untenable. Dawn would hold a position past the point where adaptation seemed reasonable. This made him difficult and sometimes costly. It also made him the wall when there was nothing else standing. For Russ, it was service. Not service to an abstract ideal, but service to a specific person. The Emperor, his father in the chosen sense, if not the genetic sense. Russ had complicated feelings about many things. He had done things during the heresy, including the burning of Prospero, that were errors of catastrophic consequence. But his loyalty to the Emperor, specifically and personally, was something he apparently never genuinely doubted. That anchored him when everything else was moving. The people who held because they had something the others didn't. Not necessarily cleaner hearts or purer souls. What they had was an anchor, something stable enough to hold when the storm came. What the traitor Primarchs lacked, in almost every case, was not courage or devotion or strength. It was that anchor, the thing solid enough to hold when everything else was moving. And crucially, what the Chaos Gods excelled at was identifying what that anchor was for each of them and finding a way to pull it loose. For Horus, they used the wound of not being enough for his father, and the fear that all his work would be discarded when it was no longer needed. For Lorgar, they used the rejection of his worship, the public humiliation of having his devotion declared wrong. For Angron, they simply pointed to what the Emperor had already done. But for Mortarion, they used his own pride against him, offering him the framing of the Emperor as a tyrant that the Pale King had been trying not to reach for years. For Fulgrim, they had the patient demon in the blade. For Magnus, they had the long chain of consequences that flowed from his own best intentions. Each attack was custom-made, each was targeted at the specific shape of a specific soul. And this, finally, is the most frightening thing about the Horus heresy. Not its scale, not its body count, not the 10,000 years of suffering that followed. The most frightening thing is how carefully it was done, how much attention was paid to each individual, how the Chaos Gods had the patience to wait and watch and learn, and then move precisely at the moment when each chosen target was most vulnerable. And the last loyal moments live in the places before those attacks landed. In Horus, looking at his brothers and genuinely loving them. In Fulgrim, with his hands in the forge beside Ferrus, making something beautiful for no reason except that beauty was worth making. In Lorgar, building the perfect city because faith and devotion were the most natural languages he knew. In Angron, before the Emperor came, surrounded by people who had chosen to follow him and who he had chosen right back. In Mortarion, looking at the lowland humans of Barbarous and deciding that he was going to make things better for them because that was the right thing to do. In Magnus, sitting with his father and talking about what psychic power was and what it could become, and believing, genuinely believing, that understanding would protect them. Those moments are real. But the stories that came after, the falls and the betrayals, and the 10,000 years of ruin and war, they are also real. But they don't erase what came before. They can't. The tragedy requires both. The fall only means something because what fell was genuinely there to begin with, was genuinely worth the fall of. The galaxy remembers the Horus heresy as the catastrophe that broke everything. But inside the catastrophe, in the spaces before the last thread snapped, there are these moments. Quiet, warm. The sons of the Emperor, still themselves, still whole. Still, for one last breath, what they were made to be. Some of them carrying wounds that had always been there. Some of them bright and unmarked. All of them standing at the beginning of something they couldn't yet see the end of. It's worth remembering them this way. And it costs nothing, and it gives something back that the story tends to take. And the next time you place a World Eater model on the table, or paint the Death Guard's plague green, or read about the demon Primarchs marching on Terra, maybe you'll see them a moment differently. Not as what they became, but as who they were before they became it. Standing at the edge, still themselves, one breath away from the fall. The Horus heresy is about many things. It's about war and loyalty and the price of ambition and the fragility of institutions built on the assumption that the people running them will always be what they promise to be. But at its core, underneath all of that, it's about loss. the loss of people who should have been something else, the loss of a future that was briefly, dazzlingly possible and then wasn't. Yes, the loss of those last loyal moments, each one different, each one holding inside it the whole shape of a man before the darkness came. That loss echoes forward 10,000 years. It's still echoing. And I think we keep coming back to this lore, keep building these armies and painting these miniatures and reading these books and making these videos, because there is something in that echo that resonates with the way loss works in any life, in any century, in any human heart. We all have things we lost before we understood what they were. We all have a last moment before something changed. The Horus Heresy just renders that truth in the scale of galaxies and demigods. It's worth sitting with. It's worth remembering. Thank you for spending this time with the lore. If you made it this far, and this was a long one, oh, I know. You know how much this channel values the deeper stories, the questions underneath the questions, the characters inside the mythology. If any of this resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking about a Primarch differently, or feeling the weight of one of these stories in a new way, drop a comment below. I want to know which fall hit hardest for you, which last moment felt most real, which of these sons you'd have most wanted to save. If you're new here, welcome to Q on 40k. This is what we do: quiet, immersive, story-first lore that tries to honor what makes this universe extraordinary. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. Hit the like button because it genuinely helps other people find this kind of content, people who need exactly this kind of slow, careful, a story-first exploration of the galaxy's mythology. And take care of yourselves out there, for the Emperor, and for the ones who fell.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.